Good morning, everyone. It's Lee Henson, President and founder of Agile Dad, and it's time for today's episode of the Daily Stand-Up. Without any further ado, let's get started. Okay, so now, just to make sure we're all on the same page, we started off with, but we're different, and we talked about coaching teams at where they are, what point they are in their Agile journey. Then we talked about how we measure our Agile health and how we get to a point where we can do some type of agility assessment and how Grow can help us get there. So now, today, part 3 of this 5-part section is gonna cover the part that I love the most. And this is where we have to say, okay, now that we know where the team is and where we are in a journey, now that we understand how we can measure our health and figure out where we need to be, the next step is going to be, once we've diagnosed, what are we going to do? What plan are we going to have to pull this together to make this happen? Now, pulling together a plan is oftentimes the most frustrating part. So let me explain that. Because I think a lot of times when people say we're going to pull together a plan, they're looking for something that's very static. They're looking for something that's very forthright. They're looking for something that's very deliberate. They're looking for something that's very step 1, step 2, step 3. What they're looking for is a process. When in actuality, we all know, because we've been strongly trained, that they should be looking for a framework. They should be looking for something that's going to give them the tools necessary to be successful, but also something with some flexibility. They don't want to limit or sacrifice flexibility in order to be in a good place. So the question becomes, how do we get there without sacrificing the flexibility? And the answer is, drum roll, you can start with a team working agreement or an organizational working agreement that discusses what the expectations are. Now, this is important. I think that at some point we need to come up with a set of guidelines or a set of, but I don't want it to be super rigid. And I think that's the difference. If we come up with some type of working agreement and say, hey, we agree that this is how we're going to work together. We agree that these are the things we're going to do to be successful. We agree that this is what makes sense in our organization, then it's going to make it easier and better and healthier for us to be able to say, this is how we're going to work together as teams. These are the things that are expected of us. These are the things that we agree that we can commit to do. These are the things that we can say with confidence are going to be okay. Because the truth is, we have to start somewhere. And I think that's another thing where organizations break down quite a bit. You know, it doesn't mean that once it's written, it's etched in stone and it can't be changed. Once it's written, it's a policy that we're going to try. It's something that we're going to agree that this is going to be our way of working. And I'm not trying to go too far down the discipline agile delivery path or the DAD path, but this is part of it that makes sense. I think every organization in some fit, form, or fashion does need to choose their way of working. They need to figure out where they are and what they're going to do. And whether it's a team working agreement or whether it's a collective bargaining agreement or whether it's how our marketing team is going to interact, a communications agreement of some sort, whether it's how we're going to handle inbound defects and other customer-facing issues, I think there's a lot for us to figure out. And I think that sometimes we just don't take the time to assess what we're going to do and how we're going to figure out and how we're going to measure certain things. So I think a big part of this too is how we're going to measure success. What does our definition of done look like? How are we going to get our product or service to our customer? What I'm trying to say is there's a lot of information that we can capture with reasonable expectations. Now, question, does that mean that it's going to work perfect every time? I hope you said no, because it's never going to be perfect every time. There's always going to be some room for variance. There's going to be some room for things to change if they don't go our way, right? And I think that I had someone who recently replied this past week on one of our LinkedIn posts, and they said that they plan in for variance. They plan in for these variables, and they don't block out necessarily a set amount of time because that's usually a bad idea. But when they go into planning, they always remind the team that something new is going to come up. Let's commit to one item less, or let's make sure, because there's no harm, no foul in moving on and grabbing an item for the next sprint if we finish everything in this sprint. But what we want to avoid is having a team consistently overcommit to the things that they feel like they can do, knowing that there's going to be interruptions and other things that stop them. So the control part of this is probably the part that's the hardest. Now, I did have a good conversation with Dave West where we were talking about some things, some examples of things that should or shouldn't be in a Scrum guide. And it was a great conversation. But the one item that I remember specifically we talked about was a term called definition of ready. And I thought that his take on definition of ready was quite interesting. His take on definition of ready was, if we lock in something to a pure definition of ready, then that basically takes away, if Scrum is designed to build complex things and there's going to be some unknowns, if we take away all the unknowns, what happens if we hit an unknown? I know that sounds silly, but definition of ready is kind of a cyclical loop. And I think that the teams and organizations that are seeking a definition of ready, for example, are the organizations that are looking for some way to assess whether the work is at a position good enough to enter into a sprint. And this is a real good example, right? Because I think that, is it important to have some type of criteria to say, hey, this is ready to be worked on? Absolutely. But is there also room for the team to have discovery and find out some unknowns? You bet. That needs to happen. If that's not happening, we have a different issue, right? So I think that the key here isn't necessarily what work we're going to do, or whether or not the work is at a state where it's going to be purely and easily consumable, even though I'd love that, right? And I always tell organizations our goal is to get to a point where the work is easy to consume and we're not constantly shuffling people, but we're adjusting a work in such a way that it makes it easy for multiple teams to swarm and get that work done, which makes total sense, right? But I think that our goal should be to get to a point where we are happy that we can time box some discovery and we can figure things out. We do set aside time for issues or for questions or for things that arise, and we take on less work each sprint so that we have some flexibility, so that we're not constantly just jamming as much as we can in there and hoping for the best, but we get to the point where we are actively pursuing, doing a great thing, and that we're setting proper goals and assess our goals. Does this match our sprint goal? Does this match our goal for the increment? Does this match our goal for what we're trying to do? And I think that if we get to the point where we can properly measure ourselves against those goals, and we're focused on building increments and not on building whole products, and we're trying to be successful in that, right, that's when we're going to discover that we're moving in the right direction. And oftentimes I hear leadership try to pin down and say, I need very specific, when will this be delivered exactly? Or how do I know this is absolutely ready to work on? Or do we have a process in place to lock in and make sure that and it makes me kind of crazy, right? But it's one of those things where we do have to address it because it happens in organizations. So it begs so many questions. And I think the key here, what they're trying to say, is that as leaders, as stakeholders, as shareholders, as product ownership, that we grow weary, we grow tired of teams that are constantly committing to do things, or constantly, I shouldn't use the word commit, they're constantly signing up to do things and never finishing the items that they commit to do. They never finish the things they say they're going to, right? So the question then becomes how important is commitment as part of the Scrum or Agile framework? And is it something that we're taking seriously? So lots of questions, lots of good stuff. And, I hate to leave you with a cliffhanger, but I'm going to, because I think the last topic that I want to talk about this week has to do with commitment and the things that we commit to and how we surround ourselves with commitment. So that's going to do it for today. Keep it short and sweet. I hope you're ramping up for another good week. As always, we encourage you, if you have a topic you want to talk about, send us an email, learnmore@agiledad.com. We'd love to hear from you. And as always, we encourage you to stay healthy, stay well, and stay agile, my friends. Until next time, do take care.